Okay, so welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. First, I'll introduce myself and then I'll pass it over to my co-facilitator, Jake, to introduce himself as well. And then I'll open things up with a land acknowledgement. So my name is Lindsay Brandt. Gowona Howie is my Mohawk name. It means she carries the words. I'm presenting today from Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory. My position at Queen's is Educational Developer, Indigenous Pedagogies and Ways of Knowing. I'm really excited to be talking to you today about this topic of navigating difficult conversations. So I'll pass it over to Jake, and then he can introduce himself, and then we'll get things started.
Thanks, Lindsay. So I'm Jake Roche. I'm a PhD student in the Faculty of Education here at Queen's. I'm currently in Kingston at the moment, and I'm currently supporting the instructional design team in the Faculty of Arts and Science with remote support as we transition to online. And some of you might also know me from work that I've done in the Human Rights Office and just equity work on campus. Back over to you, Lindsay.
Great, thanks, Jake. So I wanted to open things up with a land acknowledgement. As I mentioned, I'm coming today from Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory. This is Mohawk lands, Mohawk community here. But I also wanted to think more expansively about land this morning and what our connection to land can mean. So I wanted to draw attention to a particular Mohawk word, ade reyandere, which means to know. To know in our language that knowledge lands upon our mind, or knowledge lands. And then to me, that also makes me think about the connection of land and knowledge. Our knowledge and our ways of knowing come from the land. Our languages come from the land. So to acknowledge land, and when others acknowledge our lands, to us that means to acknowledge our existence, to acknowledge and value our presence here on these lands, and to acknowledge our ways of knowing and being as strong ways of knowing and being that can influence and impact others that live upon these lands and move through and in between these spaces that we share. So I just wanted to encourage all of us to kind of come together with one mind during this and think about our connection to each other and our connection to lands and our connection to all creation. So with that, we'll get things started. Before we actually get into the presentation, we just wanted to do a bit of a check-in to see how everyone's feeling about the topic of navigating difficult conversations, to see how you're feeling and how things are sitting with you right now with the start of fall term just ahead. So I'm going to stop sharing this presentation and open up an interactive piece that we've created using Mentimeter. So I'm going to put the link in the chat to that Mentimeter, and you can bring up that link in your own browser, and then there's an access code that I'll also post in the chat for you to be able to participate with. So those have appeared in the chat, and then I'll stop presenting this screen and I'll bring up my desktop.
Hey, Lindsay, on my end, it says it's not open for voting.
Not open? Okay, I'll just see if I can open it.
Some of the remote challenges.
Yeah, sometimes things like to act up a little bit. So if we can't get it to work, we'll just invite a little bit of commentary in the chat if we can't get the actual presentation to load. Voting is closed. I think I should be able to open it. Yeah, I can't seem to see why it's not allowing interaction. It says it should be live, but it doesn't seem to be working. So maybe we'll just have you type some responses into the chat, how you're feeling at this point, what your thoughts are around this topic, your confidence level, kind of where you're at with things, and then we'll kind of debrief a little bit about that and then jump right into the presentation. So I'll go back to sharing the presentation screen at this point.
There's so many of you, don't be shy. I'll go first.
Yeah, so I think anxiety is a common feeling, curious, apprehensive, challenging. My thought is always like the unknown, the sense of not being able to prep for things. Um, you feel a little bit of lack of control at times, nervous, excited to learn, but worried. Yeah, those are all really natural feelings to be feeling at the start of a new semester, regardless, but also maybe in a new space of online or remote learning where you might know in person how to handle these things, but when the context shifts to online, it's more difficult to predict how things might go or how you might be able to pick up on things that maybe with facial expressions and face-to-face conversations, it's much more easy to pick up on difficulties within a conversation, but online that can sometimes take a little bit more inferring and really determining and reading between the lines. So more time required to analyze the situation, but sometimes time is not available. And feeling grateful. That's great. So there's a lot of kind of anxieties, hesitations, but I don't perceive those as bad things. I was always told that it's always great to be a little bit nervous, a little bit anxious, because that means that you actually truly care about what you're doing. You care about your role as an educator, and you care about doing a good job for yourself and for your students. So I think all of those things are great, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll just have a greater level of confidence about how you might handle these conversations that will come up. So great. There's some wonderful responses coming in. So wellness can impact the positive affirmative attitude that is needed sometimes. I think quarantine is making it difficult. That's true. I think so many of us are at that stage of like just a really fatigue is setting in with everything being online and remote, and we miss that connection. We miss that those conversations that happen in the hallways on campus and those types of things. So really being mindful that our students are also feeling those things and going through those things, I think will go a long way to ensure that we're always compassionate and thinking about them as well. Okay, so we'll get started with the presentation. So today's workshop, at a glance, will be providing questions for reflection that you might ask yourself as you weave an equity lens through your course to prepare for those difficult conversations. And then considerations for anticipating and responding to difficult conversations. So we'll start by exploring some needs. So a healthy learning community engages in the following. So the first kind of key area that we've identified is to anticipate. And then the second is evaluate. And then the third is commit. And so these practices center the learner by doing the following things. So I'll pass it over to Jake to talk about those, and I can kind of click along, Jake, as you speak.
Thanks. Yeah, and so the first one's anticipate, and I think this goes. I noticed Megan's comment in the chat. You've TA'd before, but you're not sure how things are going to go online. And so what we want to do is we want to anticipate who's present in the learning community and what are they carrying with them. And so I taught for the first time as a graduate teaching fellow this summer, of course. And I anticipated that the students were anxious about being in the remote setting. And I anticipated that there were some anxieties about, they're coming to the end of the program. It was in faculty of education, and they were teachers with one foot in the classroom and one foot in the new classroom and their new life outside of the faculty. And so there's a lot of apprehension about what this final stretch would look like for them. And then there's just frustrations about current circumstances. We're pandemic, we're in social unrest. And so all of those sort of anxieties and that bubbling up, I anticipated that, and I sort of prepared for that. So that goes on to our next one, Lindsay. So I assess. So first what I do is I ask what is my own ideological position. So what do I come into the classroom? What are my biases? At the beginning of this presentation, you might have noticed that I stated my pronouns. So I'm white, cis, male. My pronouns are he, him. I grew up in a Christian background. I have Indigenous ancestors. And so all of those things sort of inform the way I interact in the faculty, in my classroom, in the university, and with my students. And I think about that and think about how I occupy space and how I take up space and how I interact with my students in that way. And then I also think about how my students might be of the similar. So, you know, you've been in classes before where you might either be, you might not see students that reflect yourself. Perhaps it's the case that you're a person of color and you've noticed that Queens is quite white. And so that creates feelings of how will you interact with those students and whether or not the space is safe. And so we anticipate that. And as educators and as a teaching team and TAs, we have to think about that. And so the next is commit. I commit daily when I enter these spaces to checking my emotions. I like to do sort of a weather forecast, and my supervisor, Dr. Lee Ayrton, does this whenever we have a meeting, and they say, you know, what's your weather today? Describe how your weather sort of connects to your emotions. And so, you know, if like yesterday I was feeling pretty foggy, and so I know that I might need to sort of amp up my energy a bit to sort of be in these spaces. And then what are my biases? What are my connections to the topic that I'm teaching? And how might that topic guide the conversation, and what is the direction that conversation is going to go based on the knowledge that I have and the place that that topic holds. And then what are the resources in my toolkit? And how can I access those resources? So I know that there's a great suite of resources by the Human Rights Office, and before I teach, I like to refresh on those. And so I completed the Navigating Difficult Conversations workshop assessment with the Human Rights Office before developing one with Arts and Science, and that really helped me sort of engage with what it was that I was going to be doing in my classroom. And then I try to unpack that before I enter my learning community. And then when I start teaching, I invite my students to do the same. So I usually sort of begin with a self-reflective ideological position exercise where students can kind of just like take away some questions that help orient them to the learning that we're going to be doing in our learning community. And this goes for any topic. Although I'm quite situated in education and social justice, I think this works for the sciences. Any topic that, you know, we're human, and our human comes first before sort of the topics that we're studying. You can go to the next slide, Lindsay.
Okay. The presentation just disappeared for me, so just one second.
Yeah, there's certainly tech issues that come up in spaces.
Many tech issues today. I'm not sure what's going on with Teams, but we've been having issues all morning, and now I'm needing to reload it. So just be 1 second.
I think this is a great learning opportunity for people to sort of take that, anticipate, evaluate, and assess, because that's sort of what we have to do with our tech problems as well, anticipate the tech issues.
Yeah, all the same principles apply when you're
yeah.
navigating difficult tech circumstances.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll get us back on track here. And I realized too, some people aren't able to see this screen because Teams is causing some issues with being able to view presentations as well. We will send it out via email after the fact. So we'll send it out to all the participants that are registered. So don't worry too much if you're unable to see it. So we'll talk a little bit more about exploring needs. So reflexivity, the examination of actions and solicitation of feedback to continually improve the learning experience. So being open to allowing your students to kind of co-lead the course with you, level the playing field, and make sure that all learners are also teachers, and giving them some agency in the classroom and in the way that you structure the learning environment is really helpful. And often when you see everyone as equal in the classroom environment, that feedback becomes helpful to all. So you might get a lot of feedback informally from your students about your teaching style, the ways in which you're encouraging them to learn in the course, those types of things. So you can have that informally influence the course throughout the way that you structure it, either with allowing for a lot of conversation. In assessments, you could have reflective journals and different things like that, where their feedback is they're reflecting on their learning, but they're also, when they're reflecting on that, it tells you a lot about your teaching too. And then, so the interrogation of attitudes and values that shape your teaching and research methods. So really thinking, as Jake said, thinking about your own positionality, thinking expansively to include your students and really engaging with them about where they're coming from as well. To really let that influence and impact the atmosphere that you're in and the circumstance of sharing that will hopefully emerge within your course. The ability to recognize the ways in which your privilege may oppress the voices of marginalized colleagues and students. So I think it's important to talk about privilege because we often think about privilege as status, we think about it as money or authority, those types of things. But we also need to think about privilege in terms of absence. Like as a privileged person, or all of us have privilege in some regard. So thinking about that, and then when you think about what you have as a privilege, so for me as an able-bodied person, I can say that I have an easier time of navigating campus and structures and even in the world of walking in the world much more easily. And then I think about as an absence, so what things in society are absent or make it more difficult or challenging for people to exist in spaces. So thinking about your own privilege and then turning that outward again and thinking about how it affects others is great. It's a good practice to get into. And then I think about that I think sometimes people get their backs up when you talk about privilege, but really it's not to say that not that people that are perceived to have more privilege, such as white privilege, that they don't have hard and difficult things that happen in their lives. That's not really what the conversation about privilege is centered on. It's more thinking about they don't have hard and difficult time of existing in spaces because they're white. And so sometimes that can be a thing that BIPOC or people of color have to navigate, the fact of existing in spaces because of their skin color, or in my case, my last name sometimes is a dead giveaway, like that I'm an Indigenous person, or the role that I'm in is very Indigenous focused. So I think the ways that I exist in spaces differ because of that, and to recognize that the absences and presence of privilege are important to look at equally. And then uncovering your biases, so really identifying how they're present in your teaching and social interactions. What's the impact of your ideological position, values, and politics? So really thinking about the ways in which your expansive view of things might be clouded. What voices do you privilege in your content, in the way that you teach, in your discipline? A lot of disciplines are very heavily influenced by certain values in politics and ideologies, and what voices get included in those disciplines and what don't. Are there ways that you can reach out and include more voices within these conversations that you're having with your students? Okay, so I'll turn it back over to you, Jake.
All right, so difficult conversations, and sorry, I'm reading verbatim from the slides just for the folks who can't see them. This is not my typical teaching. So difficult conversations and controversial topics can be an important learning opportunity for students. So in our teaching practice, we don't want to steer away from those topics. We just want to be able to engage with them in sort of a conscious and cautious manner. I think oftentimes when we think of controversial topics or sensitive topics, we tend to sort of like pump the brakes because we don't want to lean into that, and we're afraid of how the environment will sort of turn and how the conversation will turn. But sort of being aware of your control and directing that dialogue is what allows our students to learn from that opportunity, and also for yourself to learn from that opportunity. So these occurrences force us to confront our privilege, challenge our biases, and impact the ways in which our beliefs and values shape our world. Our worldview. And so whenever I enter a conversation, I sort of enter a space and I engage in these dialogues, I kind of like take the temperature of the room. And you can't do this in the same way with the virtual setting. So when we're on Zoom and we're doing a tutorial and whatnot, I can't gauge affect, which is a large indicator of how students are sort of responding. So like those physical cues that people give you can't read that in the same way on digital platforms. So then we have to be a little bit more conscious of what it is that we're saying in terms of like how we sort of structure our language, how our own affect is in that moment, and how we're unpacking things when students are sort of commenting in the chat and whatnot. So most recently, I was giving a workshop in my own course, and we engaged in a topic that was about Christianity in relation to education. And I had two students that were quite different in their beliefs, and my job there is to sort of be like the mediator for that, and to open up dialogue for both and recognize that both have a valuable contribution based on their lived experience and not invalidate their lived experience. So that's one of the considerations we have. It's, you know, how are we going to be that middle ground between two students, or the middle ground between sometimes ourselves and students who have new ideas that they're presenting to us.
Okay, so how do I set students up for success when navigating difficult topics? So that you can model critical engagement with course material and give students the tools to scrutinize assumptions and bias. Encourage the use of appropriate language and terminology in reference to marginalized groups from a strengths-based perspective. So I think sometimes before diving into difficult conversations, it's important to kind of ground yourself and your students in the understanding that we're all learning together. We're all likely to stumble and maybe misuse a word or use the wrong term when we're learning about things and describing things and talking with each other. And just to be open-minded and be okay with missteps that might occur, and then being okay with correcting each other gently and just having a lot of grace and compassion with each other. So I model this with my students. I have been teaching for the last couple of winters Foundations of Aboriginal Peoplehood course, and many of my students, the majority, are non-Indigenous. And so the terminology, I say up front, I won't be offended if someone uses the wrong term, or we need to talk about terminology before we get into these conversations. And it's okay if you, out of habit, say a different term, and then we will gently just guide each other back to the correct words that we've determined or talked about as a class. So, and it's important to talk about from a strengths-based perspective too, because there's so many negative connotations to words that maybe people aren't even aware of that they're negative, or they don't realize that they could be harmful or hurtful to another student or another group. And until those conversations and that openness emerges in your course, it can be a little bit challenging to even start those conversations where you can begin to move past just the terminology and get into the more in-depth conversation. So I like to start out with inviting everyone into a space of openness, a space of sharing, and being okay with making mistakes, and that we all learn from those and we can all benefit from that as well. And I think that creates the safety that students require to be able to engage then in those conversations more fully. So what's the right timing for difficult discussion in a remote environment? Ensure that sensitive discussions are introduced after you've given sufficient time and space for community and capacity building. This can take longer in a remote environment, of course. So Jake had some good ideas about opening things up for your students to share a little bit about their background and where they're coming from. I've done similar things with my students, like opening sharing circles when it's face-to-face, and you can recreate that in an online environment too, and just have everyone have a leading or guiding question and have everyone go around and share their answer to it. I've even started off with like land. What does land mean to you, and what's a special place to you, and kind of guide us through what you feel like when you're on that land or how you're connected. And then that creates a foundation of everyone feels safe enough to share. Everyone feels like they're learning a little bit about each other, and it tells you as an instructor kind of where students are feeling comfortable with going with their conversation, how personal they're willing to get. And kind of as you do that more and more throughout the course with your students, you'll see even the most quiet students that maybe said one or two words, the first sharing circle will open up, and by the end of the course, they're sharing a lot about themselves. And it's really nice to see as an educator and as a classroom community to experience that growth together.
And I'll just add to this one, Lindsay, sort of off of that. I think because we have a bit of a mix of folks that are in here, some of you are, instructors and some of you are TAs. If you're a TA, you're probably thinking, how do I scaffold the class when I don't have control over the syllabus, or I might not sort of be the one who gets to decide what the conversation is. And I always encourage folks to sort of engage with the instructor and articulate what your anxieties are about the syllabus. So if it's the case that you know that you'll be leading a seminar or leading things, sorry about that, we will send out a PDF of this at the end. And we're speaking specifically to the slides, so you're not missing content there. Yeah, so I like to engage with an instructor and say, like, if there is a topic that I'm concerned about leading in tutorial, asking whether or not we can change the date until I have more time to develop capacity and community with my students. And oftentimes I find that instructors are really receptive to that because they want they want you to succeed and they want their learning community to be successful. And if that's not the case, then you also have control while you're in that learning community and in those dialogues to sort of tweak what it is that you might have planned to do that day. So it might be the case that you don't lead into a conversation because you're concerned about things being unsafe for students not having enough knowledge. And I think that answers might answer a little bit of your question there, Paul, about capacity. So, what is the student's background knowledge? How comfortable would you determine the students to be with this topic? Perhaps it's the case that you've had a chance to assess one of their assignments, and you can sort of get a feel for what it is that students' positions are on a certain topic by like evaluating their work and how they engage with the work and what knowledge they have about that topic. Or it's the case that you can do a poll at the beginning, and so you can use like a Padlet or a private doodle, or do that thing like the weather survey at the beginning and ask people how they feel about the topic. And then in that moment, as you're presenting, you might choose to sort of tweak what it is that your question is or how you lead or when you invite conversation. And so a lot of navigating difficult topics, it requires a little bit of work on your part in those moments to sort of manage your expectations of how things are going to go, and manage your expectations of your students and what it was that you may have anticipated would be what the conversation is, and then the direction that you're going to take it now that you know that perhaps some students aren't comfortable, or environmental things, there's a big event in your community or globally, and the conversation for the day might not be a right fit now. So it really does require a little bit of flexibility and sort of accommodation there.
Great. Yeah, that's so true. I think sometimes you think, well, I don't really have time for those types of things to occur within my course. I think you have to kind of make a way, be flexible, and find a way for that to work, because I've in face-to-face, it's much easier to get a sense of, like, you walk into a room and it's probably not a good day to have a sharing circle on this certain topic. And like Jake said, it could be influenced by current events, things that are really highly high tension in our world right now. But you might get a sense of maybe that is a good time. And so kind of putting your feet in a little bit into the water, and then seeing if you can wade out slowly, or if your class is at a level where everyone's able to dive right in, then you'll get a sense of that. It is more difficult to do online, but definitely not impossible. And like Jake said, checking in different ways, having those opportunities for polling or engagement in that way, and then also maybe structuring into your assessments or your assignments ways that students can provide feedback. I found reflective journals to be amazing for that, because even I did sense a sense of anxiety for my students coming in, and a lot of them never experienced a sharing circle. And so walking in and having a circle format where we're all facing each other and we're asked to share was highly intimidating to them. And they reflected on that in their journals, and they said it was difficult. Like, I actually wanted to turn around and walk back out of the class and think, why did I sign up for this? But then as they progressed in the class, you could really see that they came to value that space and that time to share. And the growth was incredible to see from the beginning to the end of the course how that happened. And it happened the same way just this last winter when things switched to remote, and the same sense of community was able to develop online. So. Okay, so this is a newer concept. Just new research is emerging, like, kind of as we speak about this at Queen's. There's a student that's studying this topic, and hopefully some papers will come out soon about it. But there was always a sense of maybe we should provide trigger warnings for difficult conversations or difficult topics in our courses. But now the actual research shows that trigger warnings maybe aren't as effective as we once thought. The better thing to do is to provide a content warning. So just say, for example, next week we will be talking about residential schools and viewing a film that details the experiences of 2 survivors, rather than saying some of you may find next week's material distressing. So this encourages you to think about, provide an overview of the content without suggesting how students might feel about it, because you really never know what their reaction might be, and that reaction might be different for different people, and you don't want to kind of set them up to feel a certain way or feel like they have to feel a certain way. So rather than stating that, you can just say, this is the content and this is what we'll be discussing. And then you also don't really want to give them an opt-out of that content if it's important to the learning outcomes in your course. But you can let them know why you've included it in your course and why you think that's important, and point them to the learning outcomes or the ways in which you hope that the learning of this content will help them and assist them in their growth and development. And then through that, I think they'll be more willing to engage with it. And then what I've done too is I have the first scenario is kind of my own example, and I did show a film on residential schools. I didn't give a trigger warning, but I did offer them support during that day and after the fact, like, let's do a debrief of this. How are we feeling? Checking in with them. How are you feeling after seeing this film? And I, as the instructor sitting there, had a difficult emotional reaction with it as well. And I said, let's just take a few minutes before we even actually talk. Let's just sit back, sit with our feelings for a minute, do some breaths together, and then we'll begin speaking. And sometimes it is hard and it feels like I shouldn't be taking up time in my class with like silence. But I think sometimes that silence and that ability to know yourself as an educator, feel the energy of your students and give that space is really necessary. So for us, we didn't start talking for a good probably 10 minutes after the film. We just sat there with our feelings, with ourselves, and then I was able to start speaking about how I felt and opening up to conversations about how they might be feeling and how that impacts and influences the learning in the course and about the content. So I think sometimes allowing that space, even though at first it feels a bit awkward and it feels unnatural, it's a very good gesture, a kind gesture that you can give to yourself and your students. Okay, so I'll turn it back over to you, Jake, for this next part.
Perfect. So thanks. There are two forms of difficult conversations. First is the plan discussion. So these are the things that are sort of syllabus scheduled, reading or content specific. So you've all sort of engaged with these at least at one point, perhaps in our learning, where you see a topic that's listed on your syllabus and you know it's going to be heavy, and you know that there's a chance that some of the dialogue might be a bit difficult to sort of get through. And so that's the planned discussion, and that's something that typically the instructors thought about, and they may have scaffolded in their syllabus. So it might be the case by scaffolding, I mean it comes a little bit later. They've had a chance to build community, and now you're engaging with this topic at week 5 rather than on day 1. And so to do that, you want to establish a framework, clarify the purpose, and develop class guidelines, and then form connections, listen and respond, and debrief. And so this should be the structure that sort of leads with your learning community as you're navigating these conversations. So when you enter into that, you want to make sure that you can sort of clarify to your students why you're engaging with these topics. And then I always find it's really useful to sort of reiterate what your, especially in the remote environment, what your netiquette guidelines or class guidelines are. So you can build these with your students, and you can invite students to sort of share what it is that they want to see happen in dialogue and how students should engage. Or you can use the netiquette guidelines that are provided by the Faculty of Arts and Science in a remote teaching toolkit. And that just really helps you sort of set the tone with your students in terms of how this will go about, hopefully in an equitable and safe manner. And then the next is the unexpected. So this is usually the student initiated, topical or situational. And by topical, I mean like events that are happening now. So perhaps it's the case that you have, on your docket that you're going to teach about like X topic, and then students come in and they've had experience, or that there has been an experience perhaps in your community or globally that is pulling focus. And so that could change the way you're going to sort of talk about it. And so in this format, you want to prepare, respond, depersonalize responses, debrief, and connect. And so when I say prepare, and you're like, well, how do I prepare for the unexpected? That comes with, sort of the preparatory tools of having a bit of a pulse of what the personalities are like in your class. So sort of building the time to get to the point where you can have these conversations with your students. It's not always the case that you have that chance to prepare, but by you being here right now, you're preparing in some capacity because you're learning these tools. And so it won't catch you by surprise if you have a student that perhaps is difficult or likes to be a little bit challenging, or, sometimes it's the case that like a student is racist, also calling that out as well, recognizing that not every student wants to be in your learning community, and not every student wants to create a safe environment for you and for the peers. And that's just something that we have to sit with as a university and continue to respond to. And the next is responding to that student, depersonalizing your responses. So even if it feels targeted to you, not making it about you in that moment, and then providing opportunity to debrief as a class. So creating space to talk about with your students and then connecting. And we'll go a little bit into that on each slide there. Yeah, sorry. So both occurrences require sensitivity to ensure conversations remain equitable and the community continues to be a safe environment.
Okay, so some planned discussion quick tips are to establish a framework. So use specific questions or readings to frame your discussion. Another tip would be to clarify the purpose. So what kinds of questions could you pose that would most effectively help students meet the learning goals? And then develop those class guidelines, as we talked about, and etiquette, best practices, and rules for respectful engagement. We have a couple of different examples. Jake had highlighted that Arts and Science has an etiquette guide. I've developed a collective grounding rules and guiding principles document that I use in a lot of webinar sharing circles or online or offline circles too. And we will share those out in the package that we send you via email with this presentation and a few links to those types of things. And then number 4 is form connections. So provide students with a point of connection. An assigned reading or discussion question can set the tone of class discussion. So really grounding them in the content and always bringing the conversation back to why it's important for the class, why it's important for the learning outcomes, and those types of things. And then 5 is debrief. So it's important to synthesize what has been shared and highlight key concepts and ideas. I think sometimes you can do that in different ways. You can do that by wrapping up conversation, by having a final thoughts piece of your lecture, your time together. You can have, with my students, sometimes I like to have a parking lot idea. So if we have big ideas that are explored, but we don't get time to dive into them much deeper, you can have a parking lot where you record things down for further investigation, and then task either yourself or one of your students or a group of students with coming back the next week with a further exploration of that topic or that particular thread of conversation. So that's effective. And some people have also done exit tickets upon completion of the class. If you're physical, you can do that on paper and have them write down their one muddy point or their one question remaining at the end of your talk or your conversation together. You can do that online using like different tools like a Google Doc or Padlet or different interactive tools like that, or even just have a discussion board set up for Q&As or like that parking lot idea or exit ticket. So having a space where students can have those lingering thoughts and have them fleshed out or understood in a greater sense beyond the space and time of the block that you have each week with each other is a good idea too.
Sorry, Lindsay, I'm just, the slide's now not visible on my screen, so I'm just getting to where we're at in our presentation. Just give me a moment.
I can just continue on until you're able to jump in. So unplanned discussion quick tips. So for those unplanned discussions, prepare. So know your biases and what topics you're comfortable with discussing in class. Are you comfortable discussing the scheduled topic? I think it's important as an educator to know your own limitations and biases too, and to create space to be flexible with your class discussion. You can modify your expectations of the lesson and allow further exploration in those cases where unplanned discussions emerge. You won't be able to plan for what those might be, but you can plan for how you'll respond to that. And sometimes it does feel a little overwhelming to not know until the moment it happens how you'll respond. But I think to think about things and think about scenarios in your mind, how this might emerge with this topic, how will I handle it? So to kind of prepare yourself a little bit in that way. Oh, I think it said someone else took control of the presentation. Let me see if I can open it back up to share. Sorry that we're having so many Teams issues right now, but we'll get through it.
And so, yeah, as you're going to share, did you touch upon depersonalize, Lindsay? Our next one on the list here.
Oh, I haven't yet, so you can talk to that.
Yeah, so so when we talk about depersonalizing, it's really about remaining level-headed. I was once as a TA giving a guest lecture, and and I said something that a student responded to and sort of called me out on not being like sort of permitted to speak in this environment based on their assumption of who I was and sort of what my background was and what my position was. And I was like, no, wait a minute. Like, you know, I struggled. I came from a low socioeconomic background. Like, I know what it's like to not have money and how this can impact students. But like how I chose to respond in that moment and to either like be defensive and say, that like this is my experience and you know who are you to challenge that, or to use that as a teaching moment and sort of like invite that student in to engage with that and say like, well, why is it that you think that, and what can we learn about our assumptions that we make of other people and whatnot, and use that as a teaching moment. And so you know, in that moment it's not something inflammatory and it's not something that devalues the perspective, but it still assumes something about me that you know, invalidates my experience of being a student and being, you know, a first generation grad student, first generation university student. And so I think also oftentimes we experience these things with our BIPOC faculty and staff, or our BIPOC graduate students and our female identified graduate students. They often experience more challenges than, you know, white cis men. And so the challenge here of also sort of depersonalizing in those moments when the topics and the comments made from students are a lot more targeted and can be derogatory, can be offensive, and learning how to sort of navigate those nuances by saying, you know, this conversation is not something that we're going to engage in right now. Or if you're feeling confident and you're feeling that it's safe for you to do so, sort of unpacking that and what that looks like. In the remote setting, when I was teaching this summer, I had some students that were taking a topic that was on, I can't think of what the topic was, but it was a topic of sensitivity. And they were leaving sort of like making jokes in the chat. They're making light of that. And feeling confident as the instructor, just sort of, or like as the TA in that moment, just like call that right out and say like, you know, although sometimes humor might help us cope or navigate these conversations, that's not something that I tolerate in this moment. That's not something that we're going to engage with. And so also feeling confident to shut things down as well. You have that authority as a TA and as an instructor to say like, we're not going to engage in this. And should you wish, you can say, here are the reasons why, or you can choose to connect with that student at a later point.
Yeah, I think that's important, Jake, too, about laughter sometimes does emerge when there's a discomfort. I've had that happen in some of my courses, is when students feel uncomfortable with the intensity of a situation or a conversation. For example, the blanket exercise. Sometimes students will like nervous laugh during that exercise, and it's more like the way that I've managed it is to just like bring that right out into the open. I know that some of us are kind of giggling or laughing, but it's because we're feeling a bit of discomfort, and that's okay. And let's just kind of be respectful that people do respond to discomfort in different ways. And sometimes that is laughter, and it's not intended to be hurtful or harmful. It's just a response that you're having to this, a reaction that you're having. And so just to bring that out in the open and let students know that might be why the laughter is happening, and it might not be because they actually find it funny or anything like that, is sometimes just to name it and talk about it and then move forward is a good idea too.
And I'll take these next to Lindsay. Yeah, so then we talk about sort of debriefing. So there's the redirect. So that's calling out what the emotion is that's in the space and acknowledging that. I always think it's best to sort of acknowledge when there's discomfort, as Lindsay was saying, or acknowledge when there's humor and perhaps why there are reasons for that humor. And then also, we talked a little bit about sort of sitting with silence. And so for me, I always invite time for reflection because I think it's important, not only for myself as somebody who's part of the teaching team to sort of collect my thoughts in that moment, but I also think it's really important for students to have the opportunity to sort of sit with their thoughts for a moment before we engage in something further. And I think we often get uncomfortable with silence when we're teaching, especially in this environment. You might have noticed at the beginning, we invited you to sort of engage in our chat, and I said, I'll go first. And that's because nobody wants to go first, or perhaps because I was uncomfortable with the fact that I was really silent and I wanted something to get that ball rolling. And the same goes for uncomfortable conversations. We feel the need to fill that silence, and we feel the need to respond to that moment. And sometimes we can sort of take a moment to pause and reflect on that. And so often what I like to do is say, let's pause to reflect, and I'll go right into inviting folks to sort of do a self-reflection where they can just take a minute to write. Usually I'll pose a question in that moment that relates to that and say how are you feeling about this? And you can write about that. And then I call them back in. And that moment allows students to engage with their thoughts in a way that's personal and sort of think about their thoughts rather than having a quick reactionary comment to what's going on. And then next is connect. And so this goes back to a previous slide when I was talking about depersonalizing. This is the moment where you're allowed to sort of react to that, to the personalization of things. And by allowed, I mean sort of connecting with that after the fact. And so microaggressions and conflicts from students in class can often feel personal. And so it's always encouraged to connect with your colleagues and supports in your circle and recognize that your experiences are valid. When I was giving workshops on sexual violence and bystander response, I always engaged with somebody who was in my circle afterwards to talk about what my emotions and feelings were to the reactions of some of the students I was presenting to. And so, when I was talking about experiences with male survivorship and what it meant to be a victim of sexual violence, and I saw, the guy in the back laugh, that felt personal, and I obviously felt it in that moment as somebody who identifies as a survivor, but then recognizing that in that moment I had, an audience of people waiting to learn, and that I knew there were people in my circle that I can engage with after the fact. And so I connected with my folks who could support me in that way. And so that's one of the things that we have to be cognizant of, is knowing what our supports are and where to turn when these moments do happen.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important to kind of have that opportunity to debrief as an instructor with other instructors or other people that understand kind of the things that can come up in classes. And that's how we learn, is through community and connection and sharing about certain scenarios, and also reflecting on our own reaction. Why is it that I reacted in this way in class? Was there a different way that I could maybe best react in a future circumstance or similar situation? How might I handle that differently? And really engage with critical reflection for yourself, but then engage in conversation with others that you've identified as safe, supportive people to debrief and have those conversations with. So we'll move into the key takeaways. So misinformation often leads to hot moments in class discussions. Learning to evaluate a student's response to difficult topics and mediate contentious and potentially inequitable claims is the challenge for all instructors. So you want to establish a clear purpose, include a statement in your syllabus about your commitment to equitable learning environments, to pre-frame conversations that might emerge, uplift marginalized voices through your content of your course, but also through the students that make up your course. Check your emotions, biases, and lean on community supports when needed. So those are some of the key concepts that we want for you to keep at the front of your mind as you go into the fall semester and beyond. So thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure learning with all of you today. I'm sorry about all the technical challenges we had, but I think overall it was a very good conversation piece, and we welcome a few questions if you have any in the chat. And we will also be sending out, as I said, some resources to you, the PowerPoint presentation, a few additional resources, and we will create some quick tip infographics that we can also distribute to you as well to remind you of the strategies that we've talked about in the course. Okay. So, and you can also connect with us outside of this webinar. On the first slide, we have our emails, and you'll have those when we send it out to you. If you have any conversations that are beyond this space and time and might require a bit more time, we're happy to meet with you and discuss those, or have a conversation over email or Teams or things like that. So definitely let us know if that's the case. Okay, I see some questions coming in here.
Yeah, so Sarah asked, do you have suggestions in terms of correcting misinformation in class when that may lead to an argument versus redirecting the conversation? And that's a really great question. How I tend to sort of structure that, like I said earlier, I invite students in and ask them first why it is, like, sort of how did they get to that conclusion. So I'll ask them to explain a little bit more about what they said, or, you know, like where their knowledge was formed. And that gives an opportunity sometimes for the student to explain further, because it might not be a case of misinformation, it just might be a case of sort of misrepresentation in what they were saying, and we can sort of unpack that together. Or other times, it's the case where sort of you get to like flex your authority in that space as somebody who is directing this knowledge, and you say that is one perspective, and you know, call on research or call on knowledge keepers who say this is what the general population believes to be true. This is the information that is true, and really calling it out in that moment. It really depends on the topic and the level of sensitivity in which that topic is engaged, and sometimes, you know, it is best to redirect if it's the case that that student is just looking for an argument. But it's usually the case that I always engage that student at least in one way to explain themselves a little bit more first, and then I redirect. If not redirect by saying we're not talking about that, I redirect by reiterating the points that are correct. So I take ownership of that and I reassert sort of the authority of the information that we're teaching. And so allow them a moment to explain and then return back to the information and just restate the information that is correct and stress that that information is correct in a way that's a little bit more nuanced than saying like, this is the truth. And then sending out an email afterwards and sort of engaging with that a little bit further and saying like, hey, here's more readings on the topic that we talked about in today's class. Here's more information for you to engage with X, Y, Z, and doing it in that way where it's a teachable moment. Do you want to take the next one, Lindsay?
Yeah, that answers the question, I think, around tone policing too, is just to redirect, take a step back. And sometimes I think tone is challenging because people interpret it in different ways than maybe is intended. I know sometimes the feedback that I've received as an instructor is like, it was only one student that felt this way in my years of teaching, but like that I was ranting when I lectured. And I'm like, so they're mistaking my passion and my fire for this topic as like a rant. And so being aware of how you are projecting your the meaning behind and the intention behind your style of delivery is important too. I think that even though that comment I felt was like, it didn't reflect how I was actually feeling when I was delivering the content, it did make me think about how that is perceived by my students when I do talk about things, and to just remind myself that when I do get into that really passionate kind of mode, and that maybe changes the tone of my voice, it changes the way I present, it changes the way I deliver the content, to just maybe voice that and talk about it. Like, yeah, I maybe do seem a little angry today. This topic is something that fires me up and it gets me a little bit angry, and that's okay. And that's okay to feel that way, and inviting students to feel okay with that as well. But recognizing that tones do change, and then that there's different ways that people will take that, and kind of taking a step back from the conversation and then re-entering it when you're able to redirect things that way is good. And then there's a thought on conflict resolution and group work. What I like to do is to allow the students to come up with their own group work guidelines. Like, I encourage them to maybe talk about as a group, what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, who can take on this task of like note taker, who can take on this task of being the person that collates everything and then types it up or does something, who is really good at public speaking and wants to present this back, but have them create some kind of contract with themselves of how they'll manage conflicts that might arise in their group, or distribution of work and those types of things.
Yeah, and I think I just add to the point in response to Emma's question about tone policing. One of the things I also suggest doing is building that foundation again before you engage with your class. And so setting that out in your netiquette guidelines for discussion forum posts, that you won't engage, like that tone policing is not something you tolerate. And then also just sort of in your community guidelines when you're engaging with students, just defining what tone policing is, explaining how that sort of functions in your learning community and that you won't tolerate it. And then how that might impact certain students, certain marginalized students where tone policing often occurs the most. and using that as something that you teach first. If you begin by sort of using that as a ground for instruction and explaining why you have some of the guidelines that you have in your community, then that really sort of sets the direction for how students will then engage with their peers and with you.
Great. Okay, so I think we're definitely at the end of our time, but continue the conversation here. I have to run off to another meeting, but this chat does remain. So if it's something that Jake and I can address in the chat with you, we will. If not, we will reach out to you over email to kind of help you with those questions. And then, as I said, we'll send out those resources and the follow-up package of information. And again, just thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks to you, Jake, for co-facilitating this with me. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with you on this, and just a really good opportunity to learn from each other, I think.
Great. Thanks, Lindsay.